Today, the Antiques Roadshow comes from Biggin Hill airfield in Kent, and I've been given the chance to get an unforgettable view of this beautiful landscape. We're flying over the Weald of Kent in southeast England, and this is a plane that needs no introduction. The Spitfire. In the summer of 1940, a nation looked up to the skies as the Royal Air Force fought the Luftwaffe for supremacy of the air. Welcome to a special Antiques Roadshow commemorating the 80th anniversary of the Battle of Britain and the Blitz. Last year, we were at Dover Castle to hear stories from the first year of the Second World War, leading up to the evacuation of Dunkirk. Tonight, we continue that story. After the German conquest of France in June 1940, Hitler's sights turned to Britain. In the weeks that followed Dunkirk, dogfights raged over English skies. By September, the Blitz bombings began in cities all over the country. In this special program, we'll hear stories from viewers who brought us their most cherished keepsakes. Some filmed here at Biggin Hill, and others from road shows all over the country. We'll also hear from one of the very last surviving pilots who took part in the Battle of Britain, John Hemingway, now a remarkable 100 years old.
The main skill was luck. I had bags of luck, but here I am still.
And because of the very personal nature of the stories you're going to hear, we're not doing any valuations tonight. You sent us hundreds of stories in response to our appeal, and tonight we're going to show you just a small selection that reveal the strength of a nation in the face of adversity. On the 10th of July, 1940, the first phase of the Battle of Britain began, after the Luftwaffe attacked shipping convoys in the Channel. And less than 40 miles inland, Biggin Hill airfield would be on the front line in defending Britain from invasion. Described by Churchill as the strongest link, dozens of fighter planes took off from here every day. And as Bill Harriman found, each flight began with the same sound.
They say that warfare is 99% boredom and 1% terror. That tells you that the 1% terror is about to start. It's quite the most wonderful thing that I've ever had the privilege to ring. And I understand you've got a bit of collection of these.
Yes, it is the iconic symbol of the Battle of Britain. But of all the ones I have, this is my favourite. Actually, it's the worst conditioned bell, but it's got the most fantastic backstory because of where it came from, which is here, RF Biggin Hill. The fact it's 1939, so it would have been here through 1940, the critical time. And the fact it's been so badly battered.
I think that the engraving on it is just absolutely wonderful.
It's also hand done. If you look for a magnifying glass, it's done by chisel, hammer and chisel.
They sort of been cast at a bell foundry and then it would have been polished up. And someone would have said, oh yeah, these are Air Ministry bells, Charlie, King's Crown, AM and the date, please. I wonder, where did you get it from?
I acquired it, actually, if I'm honest, from the internet some years ago. Apparently, it was found in a garden clearance from a village not very far from here, buried under brambles and nettles.
You're telling me this great piece of British military aviation history was in a ditch?
Basically, yeah, just unloved. I suppose because it doesn't really ring anymore. It doesn't ring like a bell because there's a massive crack on the side. Because actually, they start with a clapper in them, but then that is easily removable, and quite often with these bells, it was taken away, and then there's a spanner hanging by the side, and it gets whacked by a spanner.
Well, there was somebody with a bit of iron bar and beat the living daylights out of it. To be quite honest, the markings on it, they don't faze me, simply because where this was and what it did.
And these were hung on various buildings, and during any raids or anything, not just scrambles, they would have been rung. Biggin Hill was virtually destroyed throughout the latter part of August, early part of September 1940. And this would have been rung a lot during that time,
yes,
to alert people to go to the shelters and so on. And in fact, I believe personally that's where this crack would have come, because chances are it was on the outside of a building destroyed, bell falls, cracked.
It's quite remarkable to picture it just hanging there, and a sense of peace, if you like, and the pilots either sitting around in the ready room playing cards, smoking, reading the paper, total calm reigning, and then suddenly that rings and it's up you get, chaps, scramble A flight, and they would be running for their machines. And whilst it's a fantastically iconic thing, it's actually sending some of those guys off to their death. Some of these young fellows were going up and they weren't going to come back.
My son's nearly 18. I cannot imagine him flying a Hurricane, let alone taking it off and employing it to fight. But of course, the sad thing is that the more times you flew and the more combats you had, the more you survived, the more likely you were to survive. So often it was the young guys who had very few hours on the Hurricane or Spitfire were the ones who didn't come back because they hadn't got the combat experience.
It is a truly magnificent thing, and I think it's just wonderful that it's come out of that dreadful ditch.
The pace of aerial combat was relentless, with the RAF launching up to 1,000 sorties in a single day. The risks the pilots faced were extreme, with an average age of 20 and a life expectancy measured in weeks. Almost 1 in 4 Allied pilots were lost, as Mark Smith explains.
The men who flew in the Battle of Britain during that summer of 1940 in aircraft just like this Hurricane behind us, when the war was over, they were issued with this tiny little bar to their medals, and it simply says on it, Battle of Britain. And these two lads here were Hurricane pilots. Who are they?
So these are Pat and Tony, who are the cousins of my grandfather. Both flew during the Battle of Britain. Pat was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross,
Which is this lovely medal here.
That's his there, in May 1940. And then his younger brother was also awarded the DFC in September 1940.
Now, I've read their 2 citations, and between them, up to that point during the war, they'd shot down 14 enemy aircraft.
And I think by the end, you could probably add another 7 to that as well.
So 21 aircraft between them.
I believe so, something like that, yeah.
Now, this chap here, he actually couldn't see very well.
Apparently, he went in to do the eye test to be able to pass to be a pilot. Wasn't able to do it, so someone else went in and did it for him and memorised the letters and came out and told him what letters there were. And he came in, passed with flying colours.
He also had to have his flying goggles made by an optician. So they were sort of prescription lenses, which is completely illegal in the Royal Air Force.
Yeah.
But he went on to score so many kills, I don't think the Royal Air Force would have actually worried.
I don't think they mind. He was particularly, had some really interesting stories. He went down over France and then walked 25 miles back to the coast, managed to get himself on a ship, turned back up at Tangmere, to the surprise of all his crewmates, that 8 days later he just rocked up with his parachute under his arm. They were asking, why did you bring the parachute with you? He said, well, it works, so I'm keeping it.
Absolutely fantastic.
But I think the tragedy of this is that in September 1940, we had September the 1st and September the 2nd, they were both killed within 24 hours of each other, not knowing that the other had been killed.
Oh, that's dreadful. That's right in the middle, really, of the most sort of high-pitched bit of the battle until we get to Battle of Britain Day on the 15th, when we shoot down 146 of them or whatever the newspapers said. Yeah. Probably hugely exaggerated, but it was the morale that was needed. But certainly these guys were doing a fantastic job, and they're killed right in that sort of beginning of September period where the battle is at probably its highest. They are an incredible set. They are the only 2 brothers from the battle that both win the Distinguished Flying Cross. Yeah. So they are very high up awards that these 2 lads got.
We're very proud of them as a family, very proud.
I think we're all proud of them. Men of the Battle of Britain. Well done, lads.
I'm here to talk about Flight Sergeant Robert Stevens, my uncle, who died in the Battle of Britain. I have the last picture of him holding me before he went to war. I was only 3.5 then. I can't remember a lot about him, but I've always had a feeling right the way through that he's been there. He was in training in 1939 at a very young age of 20. He shot down over Liverpool, defending the country. His body was never found. I bought a sweetheart brooch, which he gave to his wife on the outbreak of war as an emblem of love, and it was made of enamel and silver. Just a simple thing, but it meant an awful lot to us, and it now means an awful lot to my grandchildren and family.
Despite being outnumbered, RAF fighters brought down more German aircraft than they lost. But as the summer wore on, the losses took their toll. Not only did Britain need more planes, but pilots too. One pilot became a reluctant poster boy, as Hilary Kay heard.
Behind me is this incredibly powerful poster encouraging folks to join the RAF. Now, what's your relationship with that poster?
This is my father, Peter Parrott, who flew Hurricanes in France at the very beginning of the war.
So let's look at this heroic figure. When was the photograph taken?
January 1940. He was going up on, I think, to fly a display with 3 Gladiator aircraft. And then as he was walking out, a photographer said to him, "Oh, can I take a picture?" And he said, "No, I haven't got time." And he said, "Well, just look at that Nissen hut over there." And the picture was snapped. And then my father, when he came back to England in mid-May, was going down the escalators in London on the Underground and saw his picture coming up the other way.
Did he ever say how it made him feel?
And I think, well, as a man, he was very self-effacing and modest. And he did say that when he got to 605 Squadron at Croydon, halfway through the Battle of Britain, that they ribbed him unmercifully about it.
The poster boy.
The poster boy, yes.
So posters were vital
Absolutely.
to get folks to enlist, and this is exactly what it's saying. Pilot, aged 18 to 30, and so on. So your pa went on to have a heroic 1940, didn't he?
Yes.
Both in the Battle of France and the Battle of Britain. And the results are here.
He got a DFC for the Battle of France, where he destroyed or shot down or damaged 5 aircraft. And then the second bar he got for leading a squadron in Italy later in the war in 43 and 44.
So a hero in every sense. He was literally the poster boy for the RAF. It's great that you're here to tell the story.
Well, thank you very much.
Thanks very much indeed.
Once trained and ready for combat, the 2 fighter planes British pilots were most likely to fly were the Hawker Hurricane and Supermarine Spitfire. 2/3 of the British fighters were the older Hurricanes, but it was the newer Spitfire that became a defining image of the Battle of Britain. Flying as a passenger in one was a thrilling, overwhelming experience with the noise, the cold, and the feeling of total exposure. Pilot Jeremy Britcher showed me what a Battle of Britain pilot had to get to grips with when they stepped into a Spitfire for the first time.
Hop up on the wing.
Right.
That's it. Right, so I'll open the door for you. And if you climb in and stand on the seat cushion and lower yourself down in.
All right. It's got a very distinctive smell, hasn't it?
It has, yeah.
Fumes and oil.
Yep.
So this is how you steer with this tiny joystick here.
Yeah, that's it. So if you move it to the left and move it to the right, you'll see on the wingtips the ailerons are moving. That rolls the aeroplane.
Wow.
So if you want to roll to the left or roll to the right.
And this thing in the middle, this is to fire, presumably?
Yeah, it's got the gun button there. One does the cannons and one does the machine guns. And if you hit the centre, it does both together.
Gosh. I mean, is it a beautiful thing to fly?
It is perfect. It's absolutely perfect.
Or even now, you think?
It is. It's absolutely the finest piece of engineering. It's incredible. It's so well balanced. It's effortless. I can put my finger on the control column and fly it with one finger, no problem at all.
And the pilots that flew these, I mean, how experienced were they?
Well, I mean, they weren't experienced at all. Some of the guys that are flying these Spitfires in combat, 10, 15 hours on type.
And then they were in the middle of the Battle of Britain?
Yeah. So they're going up, and the guys are probably overloaded actually just flying the aeroplane on its own. They'd be in the cockpit, it's noisy, it's a hot environment. It's quite stressful being in the Spitfire when you're new to it.
Well, especially in that situation.
Absolutely.
When your life could be over at any moment.
Yeah.
And because I'm just wearing this sort of flame-retardant flying suit now, but because they were up, what, 3,000 feet, something like that?
Much more, 15, 20, 25,000 feet.
Oh, my gosh, so it was freezing up there?
Freezing cold, yeah.
So they'd be in a completely different
Yeah,
kit.
they would have had RAF uniforms on underneath, and they would have had a thick leather flying jacket with maybe a sheepskin lining. Same with the boots. So cumbersome clothes, gloves, flying helmet, oxygen mask.
So how did it work when a pilot was sitting here and wanted to engage the enemy and fire? How much time did they have?
It's seconds, a matter of seconds. These guys, the advantage you may have had if you'd had height and speed and you saw your enemy below you, dive in quickly, potentially even 500 miles an hour, a couple of seconds burst. If you could hit the guy, great. If not, you'd be out and gone. Because if you hang around in there, you're going to get engaged by someone else on your tail before you know it, and you're going to get shot.
Well, they must have been utterly terrified.
Yes, completely terrified, I should think.
I mean, could you imagine doing that?
I flew this aircraft for the first time with sort of 4,000 hours. And I'd had a few, when I flew it for a couple of times, I got 5 hours under my belt. I couldn't even imagine going into combat after that little experience on type. Because you'd be so overloaded just flying the aircraft in itself and concentrating on the instruments and making sure you're doing the right thing in the cockpit, to actually have that spare capacity to look out and look around and check for enemies was just incredible. I think I certainly would have been shot down within seconds, no problem at all. I wouldn't have even seen the enemy, I'm sure.
I mean, I always thought, of course, how brave the pilots were. But sitting here in this beautiful, but nonetheless
a machine.
Thin frame, you know, between you and the enemy, it makes you realise how remarkably courageous they were.
Yeah, absolutely. So brave.
My name's Tim Down. My father flew 480 operational sorties during the Second World War, almost exclusively in Spitfires. Amongst the range of memorabilia that he left us were his uniforms. One particularly prized item is this menu, which is for a dinner which was held in honour of 91 Squadron by the town of Folkestone. And the reason for this dinner was the fact that they were able to thwart a raid on the town which avoided a lot of damage being done, and so this celebration dinner was held. And a particular feature of the dinner is each dish is named after one of the squadron pilots. For example, we have asparagus round, new potatoes Davy, and sauce down. That's my father. And on the front of the menu are the signatures of all the pilots, including my father's, which is there at the top.
On the 20th of August, during the height of battle, Churchill famously praised men like Pilot Down, saying never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few. And while the Spitfire may be the name now associated with the Battle of Britain, it was the older Hawker Hurricane that shot down the most enemy aircraft. Though slower and less maneuverable than the Spitfire, the Hurricane was known for its ruggedness, taking hits but carrying on the fight before the pilot had to bail out.
Our battle-scarred Hurricanes come back for more fuel and ammunition. Then it's off again to plunge into enemy formations.
Some pilots bailed out and returned to the fight multiple times, leaving wreckage of planes all over southern England, which is still being salvaged and cared for by military enthusiasts today.
My name is Roger Pickett, and one of my passions is aviation archaeology. Very recently, myself and a group of historians excavated the remains of a Battle of Britain Hawker Hurricane at Fobbing in Essex. On the table is a small selection of the items we recovered. A little fragment of rocket cover casing with Rolls-Royce on it, a Browning machine gun. Most importantly, the aircraft's identity plate is here. The date on there is the 10th of June 1940. Pilot Officer John Hemingway, flying P3966, was shot down by at least one Messerschmitt 109. John bailed out, and then he opened his chute and landed in Pitsea, his aircraft crashing right beside Fobbing Creek. And that was it, forgotten about. The one item we found from this aircraft, which to us is the heart of the aeroplane, is the control column, which the pilot steered the aircraft. This control column. You can see there's a gun firing button there. This would have operated the 8 Browning machine guns. It's fire and safe. This was in the fire position when we recovered it. So we know that Pilot Officer Hemingway was actually in combat when he was shot down.
John survived this crash, one of 4 he suffered during the war, and using the Hurricane's unique identity plate, Roger was able to track him down and reunite him with his steering column he last saw 80 years ago. In the summer of 2019, John Hemingway marked his 100th birthday in his native Ireland, and he still vividly recalled his experiences as a fighter pilot in the Battle of Britain.
We're all in our early 20s. I was 20. We just didn't care. There was no right or wrong. The war was on. We were pilots. We were going to fight them all the time. Not that we were brave or anything, but there was nothing else. the world was at war. And you couldn't go somewhere and say, I'm at peace and I don't fight wars. I liked the Hurricane, so I can say nothing against it. It was easy to fly, and it was marvelous to fly. It did all the things that were expected of it in those days. Now, it would be about which was enough to turn you over and do all sorts of things. And if you were fighting, you'd be pressing this button as well. It's a good thing, but not shooting people. Not that I mind shooting them when I shot them, but and they shot me.
On the 26th of August, 1940, John was shot down over Essex, burying his Hurricane deep in Fobbing Marsh.
I just remember coming down. You've got to push yourself out good and hard, or else you hit the tail. But and then you're floating down. Then I bailed out late because there was a cloud there. I didn't bail out straight away at 17,000, like a goon while they took a shot at me. Because it was me they were trying to kill, not the aircraft. The main skill was luck. You had to be lucky. No matter how good you were, for instance, my boss, Dickie Lee, was the best pilot I've ever seen. But he was shot down and killed. So he had no luck. I had bags of luck. I couldn't do that. But here I am. It's either being Irish or being lucky, one or the other. If you're both, you're really lucky.
But it wasn't just luck keeping pilots like John in the fight. Essential to the success of the RAF's defences were the control rooms mapping dogfights across Britain. These used information from observer corps spotters and radar to track British and German planes throughout the battle. Members of the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, the WAAF, would plot the course of these planes on a central map, giving the controllers the information they needed in almost real time. These little wooden markers represented actual battles raging in the sky. But when the war was over, they were packed away and forgotten until the makers of a movie came calling, as Mark Allam discovered.
These really are Second World War indicators from the Battle of Britain. I believe there's a very interesting story behind the acquisition of these. Can you explain that to me?
Sure. My father lived near RAF North Weald, which was one of the scenes where they filmed the Battle of Britain film. And a friend of his was a young assistant in the art department. And one of his jobs, he had to go to one of the preserved operations room that was really used in the Battle of Britain.
Right, okay.
At RAF Uxbridge, where they had drawers and drawers full of these original plotting table markers.
Right.
So the chap showed him round, he opened all the drawers, he said, pick out whatever you need to use, you can keep them.
Right, OK. So, in fact, we've got a really interesting double story going on there. We've got original Battle of Britain World War II markers with a strong connection to one of the most iconic films,
sure,
The Battle of Britain. Incredible. Can you explain to me, though, how these items actually got our aircraft into the air?
What would happen, a German raid would be spotted by an observer corps post. That would be phoned through to the operations room. Then the WAAFs would get out one of the white triangle markers, making sure that it had the number of the next raid to be reported.
Right.
In this case, it's Raid 91, and it consists of 4 aircraft.
Right,
so
okay.
you could alter the number on the wooden board according to how many aircraft are involved. And then the slightly bigger marker, with a round blue metal marker, is individual to each squadron. The RAF controller can decide which squadron he wants to send to intercept the raid. So in this case, he's decided he wants 604 Squadron to scramble to 25,000 feet to intercept Raid 91. The WAAFs then, through their headphones, they pick up on that, they put that marker on the table, so that all the time the controller's looking down on the table, can see at a glance exactly what's happening.
So it's an incredibly responsible piece of work to do, and they're constantly updating and changing that information. Nerve-wracking stuff.
Sure, people's lives depend on it.
One thing that I should remind everybody of is the price that was paid here, as we're at Biggin Hill, by the people that ran not just the airbase, but the control room as well. There was a day, August the 30th in 1940, where Biggin Hill suffered a terrible, terrible attack by the Luftwaffe, which killed 39 people that day.
It wasn't just the pilots in the air that paid the price. Everybody on the ground was in the front line just as much.
Yeah, absolutely.
The war was being brought to them.
Absolutely. So this may be an inanimate object, but the incredible thing about this object is that it would have set in motion a chain of events. The WAF, the lady from the Women's Auxiliary Air Force who would have been pushing this across the table, would have been in effect commanding something to happen, and that at the end of the line would have been a man in the cockpit of a plane, and he may not have ever come home.
No, a young man's life hanging in the balance.
As well as British airmen, the RAF relied on those who'd fled from the German advance across Europe to continue the fight in the UK. The largest group were the Polish, who dubbed Britain the Island of Last Hope. Here they formed the 302 and 303 squadrons, who were vital for both their skill in the air and support on the ground, as Siobhan Tyrrell found.
Here we have a fantastic photograph of your father. Can you explain what he did and how his story fits in here?
This is my dad, Jerzy Waluga. He was a member of the 303 Squadron, Polish Air Force under the RAF. He started his career in the Polish Air Force, and he was based at Vilnius when Poland fell to the Germans and the Russians. The Polish forces were ordered to try and repatriate themselves with Allied forces. So my dad actually escaped from Poland. He went through Romania and Hungary through to Syria. He ended up in Beirut. He was shipped from Beirut on a French boat and was landed in Marseille. Then he was shipped from La Rochelle back to the UK.
What an epic journey.
Absolutely, 3,500 miles.
Wow. And luckily, he brought his camera with him, so he actually took so many photographs of his escape and his time with the squadron, 303 Squadron. And the first photograph that's great to show, can you explain what it is?
Yes, this is my dad escaping from Poland. It's probably somewhere around about Romania or Hungary, although we don't really know.
And they were first greeted with a little bit of scepticism, the Poles coming over. But of course they were absolute veterans and their reputation was outstanding. You know, I think in the first 6 days they took down about 26 enemy aircraft with no losses.
Indeed.
Which was way ahead of the rest of the Allied squadrons. We've got a wonderful photograph with a Hurricane here. Which one is he?
He's actually the guy standing on the ground. Quite dapper in that,
He's
of course.
Very good-looking chap.
But at that time, during the Battle of Britain, he was actually an armourer.
And we forget about the unsung heroes of the ground crew. The ground crew were the absolute lifeblood of the squadron. They had to make sure that the planes were able to be turned around within, I think the ideal time was 12 minutes from landing. So he kind of got much sleep. I think it must have been constant.
Yes. And bearing in mind that they were losing their numbers as well, and that was very upsetting for the pilots and the ground crew, because the ground crew, they were like a family.
So at the end of the war in 1945, hundreds and thousands of Polish had expected to return to an independent Poland. But to pacify Stalin, Poland was actually given over to communist rule. What happened with your father and what was his take on the situation?
Dad felt quite bitter about it, so much so that the medals that he won during the war, I remember as a child were just chucked in a box in our sideboard. Apart from one, which was this one, this was his squadron badge. The 303 Squadron He was so proud to serve with the 303 during the Battle of Britain, along with his comrades, and in fact the insignia is on his gravestone. He was that proud of it that we had it engraved for him.
But it wasn't just the ground crews keeping the pilots flying. Civilians all over the country housed and fed airmen in need of some home comforts. And Paul Atterbury had a chance to meet a witness to these rare moments of peace right here at Biggin Hill.
It's 80 years since the Battle of Britain was fought in the skies above us here. And it's a real treat and a real privilege to meet somebody who was actually here at the time. It's so unusual today to have personal memories. And you're Helen, I know, and this is your granddaughter.
My granddaughter Helen.
Now, tell me, what is your connection?
Well, I was there. I was 5 years old. I can still see the pilots' faces, you know. They were very young, very, very young.
But they were in your house?
They were in, yes, they stayed in my parents' house.
There's a photograph here of a group of pilots, and there's a small girl right in the centre there. Is that you?
It is.
And they're people you remember?
They are, yes. I don't remember all them by name, of course, but I remember their faces.
Well, one of them I can read is quite a well-known name.
Yes.
It says Donald Kingerby, next to self, that's you. There he is. Now, he was one of the great names of not just the Battle of Britain, but the years that followed. A very, very successful pilot. The picture's interesting because it says Christmas Day 1940.
That's right.
So, did you have a party or what?
Yes, my mother gave them lovely parties. She took care of them as well as she could. They used to swoop their Spitfires low over the house, and we used to rush out onto the lawn and wave our handkerchiefs at them.
And did they wave back?
Oh, yes, of course they did, yes.
So here's this great photograph of your family and all those boys in your house at Christmas.
Yes.
But I'm now moving from that to this bracelet here.
Yes.
Tell me about that.
Well, each of the pilots gave my mother a sixpence. In memory, I suppose, or a little thank you.
Good luck.
Good luck, yes. And she had it, each sixpence put on that chain, and in the middle there's a plaque which says, in commemoration of the DFM, which is the Distinguished Flying Medal, of course, and there are more names on the back of it.
Right. So there are two names there.
Two names there, yes.
Which are Kingerby and Riddler. What I want to do is turn that over now. When we come to the other side, it takes us down a different story, because everybody knows about Hurricanes and Spitfires. But what is forgotten often is that there is actually a third aeroplane called a Defiant.
No.
Here it is.
Yes.
It was a very strange aeroplane. It looks like a Spitfire. It has the same engine, the Merlin, but it has a gun turret mounted behind the pilot. So it has a two-man crew, a pilot and a gunner. And the idea from the late 30s was that you didn't need forward-firing guns to attack bombers. It was very, very active during Dunkirk.
Oh.
Defiants were very, very busy, and they were very successful there because the Germans hadn't learnt that it had no forward-firing guns. No. After Dunkirk, it went into service in the Battle of Britain, but of course by then the Germans had learnt that all you've got to do is attack it head-on, and it has no defences.
Yeah.
So it was very good with bombers, it wasn't so good with fighters. The Defiant losses built up steadily. I think 700 and something Defiants of this type were built. Only one survives.
Oh, my goodness.
And those people on the other side, the four names there, were all Defiant pilots or gunners.
Yes.
Barker and Thorne the pilot and Barker the gunner, they were almost the best-known Defiant pilots and team. Gunner. They were the aces.
Oh.
They fought over Dunkirk, they fought in the Battle of Britain.
Oh, that's lovely.
And they were not separated as a crew until, I think, 1942, when they went off and did different things. So you wear the bracelet on November the 11th and on Battle of Britain Day, September the 15th.
Yes.
Is that story going to continue, do you think?
I certainly hope so. It's so important, you know, because they were just so brave. And I'm going to pass it. I've told my granddaughter all about the stories.
Yes.
And she's going to wear the bracelet after I've gone.
Nen's told me about it for years, that she's planning to pass it on to me, and I consider it an honour.
I think it's great stuff, and thank you for sharing it.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
That simple bracelet reveals the gratitude shown by the pilots to the army of people who supported them. These unsung heroes and heroines captured the imagination of artist Elva Blecker. she joined the Women's Auxiliary Air Force and set out to document daily life at Biggin Hill Air Base, as Frances Christie discovered.
We're sitting here in front of this self-portrait of the artist Elva Blacker, painted in the 1930s, shortly before she came here to Biggin Hill as a WAF. Now, it's thanks to her talents as an artist that we know so much about life here at Biggin Hill during the war, because she painted over 1,000 portraits of both the pilots and the very many other people who were supporting those few in the air. Now, how did you come across her work?
Well, she's actually my great-aunt, and about a year ago, I happened to be in my mother's attic, and I just found these 2 boxes, brought the boxes downstairs, and inside was just all this sort of history about her time in the WAF.
While she was at Biggin Hill, she started off as a motor transport driver, but accounts tell that every spare minute she had, she was around the base painting, drawing, capturing both life behind the scenes but also the people. And you've brought this wonderful image of the MT section, so the motor transport section, and there are zillions of portraits. She must have been quite a character to have gained such access across the base, to have gone into rooms where possibly she might not even have been allowed, and also to have painted so many people and to have persuaded them to sit for her. What was she like?
It was her way of being social. So instead of perhaps going to a pub after hours, she would go and find someone to sit and talk to and paint. And everybody knew who Elva Blacker was on base.
So we've got this amazing panorama, if you like, of the operations room here at Biggin Hill, and you can see all of the officers looking down onto the table where you've got members of the Women's Auxiliary Air Force plotting the position of planes.
I'm really proud of her because she wasn't a commissioned war artist, yet she's somehow accidentally created an unrivalled record of life on an RAF base.
And she was quite ahead of her time, because it does feel like we've got, you know, the Facebook of Biggin Hill amongst all of her sketches.
That's right. No, we didn't have phones then. No one else could just go around and take photographs of people. So she documented them, like you say, in this way. And it's inspiring, I think.
On the 3rd of September, 1 year after Britain had declared war on Germany, Supreme Commander of the Luftwaffe, Hermann Goering, declared that Germany was on the brink of victory against Britain. He was wrong. The RAF's resistance had stalled Hitler's invasion plans, which were soon indefinitely postponed. Instead, the Luftwaffe changed its strategy and focused its efforts on British cities. On the 7th of September, sirens around the capital began to wail, warning Londoners to take shelter. While the Battle of Britain was coming to a close, the Blitz was just beginning. Though this was a major change in German tactics, targeting British cities was an idea which had been toyed with well in advance, as Mark Smith found at Dover Castle.
So here we are in a gun emplacement, defending England, and you bring me a game which is all about attacking England. Bombers over England. Is this from the family, or where did you get it from?
I bought it at an auction. I just thought, wow, it's a toy, but it's history.
Have you ever seen one before?
Never.
So we'll take the lid off and let's have a look at what's inside. So what is the game about?
Well, basically, it's a pinball game. And as you can probably see from the map, you've got various parts of England are targets for the Germans. But quite interesting, which really caught my eye, was the fact that you've got minus points there for Brussels and Amsterdam, so signifying that they've been taken by the Germans, which was around May 1940. But France hasn't fallen yet. It's still got Calais there with plus points.
And whilst this game is being played, the British Expeditionary Force and the French are in Dunkirk.
Right.
So I suppose really this is a game about the next phase, which is going to be the capture of France and the invasion of England. So going down various targets at Shetland Islands, Scapa Flow, that's 100 points, obviously Royal Navy bases. Aberdeen, Glasgow, Newcastle, Liverpool, Birmingham, London, 100 points. actually all of the places that will become the targets during the Blitz. Have you played it?
Once or twice, yes.
Should we give it a go?
Why not? OK.
Here we go. So I pull this back. Ah, a score. Who's it for?
Well, I did some translation of the German rules there, and it said it's for young and old. Horrific, the indoctrination of it, but we know that's the way the Germans went their propaganda ministry.
Total indoctrination. So even though this is for children, it's about conquering the world, really, and the next target is England, and that's where we're going. And we're going to do it with the Luftwaffe. We're going to bomb them. And as we know, it's quite prophetic, really, because within a very few months, in the same year, 1940, we'll have had the Battle of Britain, and then it'll be the Blitz. And then these targets, these cities in this game will be destroyed for real.
That's frightening thought. It really is.
The threat of civilian bombing had been expected by the British government, who'd evacuated millions of children from cities before the outbreak of war. But there was one group of children who faced a different threat entirely. On the 30th of June 1940, just weeks after the Allies had fled France, the Nazis had occupied the Channel Islands. In advance of German occupation, thousands of children were evacuated onto the same boats used to rescue the injured at Dunkirk. The stories of the evacuees from Guernsey have been collected by historian Gillian Mawson. Gillian, we're used to hearing stories about evacuees out into the countryside early in the war, but it was a very different story for the children from Guernsey, wasn't it?
Yes, they were sent from a little rural island into the industrial towns of northern England.
Into places like Stockport?
Yes, Stockport, Oldham and Bury and places like that.
So why was that and when did it happen?
This was in June 1940 and by that time the Germans had reached the French coast, and if you were in Guernsey, which is only 30 miles away, you could see the fighting and hear it, and it put the fear of God basically into everybody in Guernsey.
And it all happened very suddenly. I mean, this is the newspaper, is June the 19th, 1940. Island evacuation, all children to be sent to the mainland tomorrow.
Yes. I mean, what a decision to have to make.
So did they end up getting sent to places where other children had been evacuated from?
Yes, so people had sent their own children away, and then 9 months later they were taking in Guernsey children.
And how many children were evacuated in total?
20,000.
So 20,000 children evacuated at 24 hours' notice?
And it's so lucky that they did, because the island was occupied by Germany on the 30th of June.
Wow, so just 11 days later?
Yes.
Looking at the list in the paper of what the girls and the boys could take, I mean, it's precious little, isn't it? One vest, a pair of knickers. I mean, one pair of knickers, a petticoat, hankies, slip and blouse, and a cardie.
This is actually a case that belonged to a little girl called Pamela, who was 2, and this is what she took with her.
So it was all in that?
Yeah.
In that little case?
That's all she had. But she had to wear all the rest of her clothes on the journey, and it was a really hot summer's day.
Oh, she took her dolly?
Yeah.
And a lovely little smock dress?
Yes.
Just 2 sent off into the great unknown?
Yeah, yeah.
And what happened to Pamela, do we know?
She was cared for by a family called Mr and Mrs Jones, and she had a really lovely time. But because she was so young, she soon forgot her own mum and dad. She forgot what they looked like. She didn't have a photograph. So when the war ended and she went back, she was 7, she went back to a couple who she didn't recognise, and she told me that she spent several weeks crying every night, not in front of them because she didn't want to upset them, and thinking about Mr and Mrs Jones in Stockport.
So no happy family reunion for her?
No, no.
And I expect she wouldn't have been the only one.
No, no. I spoke to quite a few people who had a very unhappy time when they went back.
Fascinating to hear about this. I mean, just seeing a newspaper like that, as a parent myself, the idea of having to hand over my children tomorrow.
Yeah.
My goodness. Well, we need to remember these things. Gillian, thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Fiona.
Back on the mainland, cities targeted by the Blitz were ravaged, and more than 1 million homes were destroyed or damaged. These attacks were recorded on film, in photographs, and by one London bus driver on canvas.
I'm Maureen. Henry Stockley was my grandfather. He was an artist and a bus driver and drove through London during the Blitz. The painting of the dispatch rider was in fact his brother-in-law, who was a dispatch rider in the war. Very often his painting was on primitive materials, as is this one here, which he used an old chair because he couldn't afford to buy the canvas. He was exhibited once with Picasso, which was quite amazing, and I hadn't realised until we discovered all of this in a box that he was quite a special man. There are two wonderful pictures of the Blitz. This one here is just so lively and full of colour. Henry often talked to me about the Blitz and driving his bus through London and how terrifying it was and yet quite amazing. Henry was a very kind man, and he liked talking to me about his painting and his pictures and his hopes that one day he would be famous, and he would be so thrilled to know that his pictures were being on the roadshow now, were he to be alive.
Mark, you were born in the East End of London,
That's
weren't
right.
you?
Walthamstow. Yep.
And the Blitz had a big impact on your family.
It certainly did. I mean, they were right there in the East End where the raids were going to take place. Grandad had been in the First World War.
And that's him in this picture here.
That's Grandad in the First World War. He was a volunteer in 1914, and by October 16 he was discharged, very badly wounded. Tried very hard in 1940 to join the Home Guard, but was turned down because he was too injured. And he became part of the fire watching community of Walthamstow. This is his hat. Used to hang in the coal cellar at my nan's, and I liberated it when I was about 6 because tin hats are fantastic.
And who have we got here then?
So these two are my father, Leslie.
In his pilot's outfit?
Yeah, he joined the Royal Air Force in 1941.
Wow. And then this is your uncle?
My uncle Victor, Dad's big brother. He was called up in 1939, but he had asthma, so he couldn't go. But he, like all three of them, were fire watchers in their part of Walthamstow.
And did they have any narrow escapes? I imagine they must have done.
The Germans used to drop these 1 kilogram bombs that just burned. They dropped them all over London to set light to things. But they'd worked out that there were fire parties trying to put them out, so they put an explosive charge in them. And one of these landed in Lloyd Park. And my dad and Uncle Vic were out that night, and there it was burning on the grass. And Dad said, leave it. But Uncle Vic was very, very fastidious. And he advanced towards it, as my dad always said, with his shovel of sand. And just as he got there, it blew up. And it blew all of his fingers off along the line of the shovel, and all of the burning magnesium hit him in the face.
Oh. And what about this piece of rope here? What's that?
The Germans, as the Blitz went on, they started to drop sea mines, so huge things. I mean, these are bigger than pillar boxes. They're huge. They came down on parachutes, and the concept is that they had a contact fuse in them. So when they came down swinging on the parachute, when they hit the roof, the mine didn't explode like a bomb upwards. They exploded sideways, so it blew the whole street down. Wow. And on the corner of Forest Road and Winds Avenue, one of these came down in the Blitz. It killed 40-odd people. If you go there today on the corner, you can see a new block of flats in amongst the Victorian houses. Uncle Vic lived round the back. He walked up the road, and that's part of the rope from the parachute from that mine.
And kept it ever since.
Yeah. Honestly, because of them, I have been utterly hooked and fascinated on this period because this lot lived through it, and I was so proud of them.
And millions of civilians joined the voluntary services on the home front. From fighting fires to driving ambulances, groups like the Air Raid Precaution Service and the Women's Volunteer Service became known as the Army Hitler Forgot. Though the few may have turned the tide in the Battle of Britain, the Battle of the Blitz was won by the many. And as Francis Christie saw, some people did their bit without losing their sense of humour.
So most of the images that we're familiar with from the Second World War are very documentary in nature. But what I love about what you've brought along is we're seeing a totally different side to the war effort. We've got this hysterical cartoon. Now, I understand the artist was your mum.
Yes, Phyllis Bannon. She and my father had just got married, and he had gone to join up, and she joined the ARP and drove ambulances from Orpington, which covered Biggin Hill.
That explains this cartoon where you've got a lineup of women wearing their hats all dressed up, and she said, "Lady drivers, fall in, 1:15 a.m. on a moonlight and frosty night." How did she become an artist?
She went to the art school in Regent Street, and then when Walt Disney came to London to bring the Mickey Mouse comic over here, she got a job for him working, doing not only the cartoon, the picture side, but also the word side as well. That's her in Walt Disney's office in Wardour Street.
And then what I love is this sketchbook which you've brought, and she's created this amazing design on the front with ARP, air raid precaution, and then this pattern of what are clearly her ambulances. If we just flip open, got these amazing cartoons. This one, that's amazing. Yes. Guess who? And there she is, completely covered.
Decked from head to foot.
Exactly, yeah. With her gas mask. And then this pose, which we've all done it, hanging around, waiting.
I've got to.
Waiting,
yeah, if I absolutely have to, I shall wait. As Brits, I think we've got this reputation as staying, keep calm and carry on.
Puff up a lip.
But also make a joke of it.
Yeah.
And even here, here we go, pay in the early days.
Yes.
There she is.
Poor little woman.
Surrounded by these sort of gruff gentlemen, feeling sort of a little bit small. It's an insight into the psyche of the home front.
Yes, quite. Dad's army touch.
Everyone had to get on with it. And we were able to see the funny side. And I love what she's written in the front, because I think it sort of encapsulates it all. She says, "To shift to with whom I have worked and played, eaten and slept, grumbled and giggled for over 2 years." And it's thanks to the amazing efforts of people like your mum that we, made it to the end.
We got through, yes.
And the only reason she left was because she was pregnant with Angela. So.
Well, I mean, lucky you to have quite such an amazing mum, to have grumbled and giggled with Phyllis Bannon for your whole lives is such a special experience.
Yes.
Well done, Mum.
My name is Carol Walker. This is my father, Albert Britton. He was the squad leader in the Greenwich Heavy Rescue Service during the Blitz. He was a very small man and affectionately known as the Ferret because he was the person who climbed into collapsed buildings to rescue people. This is his George Medal, which I'm very proud of. He got this George Medal where he rescued 5 people from a collapsed building. The rescue squad were called out to a house in Charlton which had collapsed, and when they got there they could hear a man crying for help, a baby screaming, and a mother saying, "Save my baby, save my baby." He got them all out and it took 5 hours. My father was just an ordinary man, but he did something really extraordinary.
On the 11th of May 1941, after 57 nights of continuous bombing, the intensity of the Blitz finally began to wane as the Luftwaffe turned its attention east towards the Soviet Union. Withstanding this onslaught had come at a heavy cost. Around 40,000 civilians killed and a further 87,000 seriously injured. But Britain remained undefeated. Though this battle had been fought by the men and women of Britain, they were aided by supplies and support from all over the Empire and Commonwealth. This included 16,000 volunteers from the Caribbean who came to Britain to help take the fight back to Germany. Mark Smith met the daughter and great-nephew of John Blair, a navigator from Jamaica who found himself in rainy Yorkshire.
Who is this gentleman?
So this is my father, John Blair, and he was concerned about what Hitler was doing across Europe and signed up.
And what did he sign up for?
He signed up to be in the Royal Air Force. He came in about 43, 44.
He was trained in Canada, came over to Yorkshire and flew with 102 Squadron
Halifaxes as a navigator, full tour over Europe.
So 30 missions?
30 missions until the end of the war, and was then transferred to Pathfinder Force, which is an elite force, as you probably know.
Absolutely. Only the best navigators
Only the
ever
best.
got to Pathfinder.
Only the best.
And we see here that he wins the Distinguished Flying Cross.
That's right.
And as we always say, we like to put that in context, it is only 2 away from a Victoria Cross.
Yes.
So it's a very high award. What did he think about coming over here?
Like all of them, he didn't talk about it, but he just heard that speech from Churchill and said, I have to come. If Hitler wins, what's that going to do for the rest of us in the Caribbean?
Was he the only one that came?
No, there were 400 aircrew and 5,000 ground crew. And that sentiment, that fear of a return to slavery was a motivating factor for almost everyone who came. They understood that if the Nazis conquered Great Britain, that the Caribbean would return to slavery. They were very, very worried about that.
It's a difficult question, but how was he treated in the Royal Air Force?
He, like almost all his Caribbean comrades, said that he was very well treated. And what I think is really interesting is that the RAF, even in 1941, established a system of integrated crews. So you would find a New Zealander, a Jamaican, a Sikh, all in the same aircraft, as opposed to other nations where they had segregated services. And it's an incredible achievement, given the era, and a lesson for us today. We can actually do that. He was based in Yorkshire, and he described Yorkshire as an extremely friendly place. He couldn't buy a pint in the pub, they'd just buy it for him. And he actually married an English nurse, Sarah's mum, who he met on a casualty evacuation flight. And he stayed in the RAF until 1963.
It's an incredible career. 20-odd years in any service is a huge career in a military service. He was one of those people that really did come and made the difference. And I think that's something we really do need to remember, that it wasn't just us in this little island, it was the world that came to help us, as you say, to beat evil.
Yes.
John Blair served in the RAF for a further 18 years after the war, but for many young men, their time with the forces was cut tragically short. The chapel here was built as a memorial to those who lost their lives flying from Biggin Hill. And as we've heard from the stories here tonight, the Blitz spirit came to symbolise British resistance. And many more lives would be lost before the war was won. But thanks to the dogged courage and resolve of the few, and to the many who supported them, Britain was safe from invasion. From this special Antiques Roadshow, bye-bye.
State-of-the-art graphics reveal the pivotal moments of the Battle of Britain on BBC 4 tonight at 9. And on Tuesday at 9, here on BBC One, Ewan McGregor and his ex-RAF pilot brother reveal some of the inspiring stories from the conflict. Next tonight, one of those sit-up and listen moments, Extinction, the facts.